Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for session 2 of 10 symposium sessions titled Making African America, Immigration and the Changing Dynamics of Blackness. The symposium is a collaboration between the Center for Global Migration Studies, University of Maryland, and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I am the chair of this session. My name is Merle Collins, University of Maryland professor in the English department with a focus on Caribbean literature, and also director of the Latin American Studies Center at the university. Today's symposium is titled Transnational Ties and Conceptions of Home. The meanings and experiences of home are often complex. This panel interrogates notions of home and homelands through discussions of issues including return migrations, dual residencies, historical memory, familial ties, and changing technologies of communication. We have 3 wonderful speakers. I'll give brief biographical details for all 3, and they will present in the order in which I introduce them. Professor Violet Showers Johnson is Professor of History and Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts at Texas A&M University. The most recent book, co-authored with Marilyn Halter, is African and American, West Africans in Post-Civil Rights America. Published by NYU Press in 2014, it highlights the experiences of first and second generation West African immigrants in the United States and explores cultural identity formation and translocal connections among them. Professor Johnson served as lead editor for a 2018 volume of essays entitled Deferred Dreams, Defiant Struggles, Critical Perspectives on Blackness, Belonging, and Civil Rights. She's currently working on a single-authored monograph tentatively titled Black While Foreign, African, Afro-Caribbean Immigrants and Race and Racism in Late 20th Century America. Our second speaker will be Dr. Paul López Oro. He is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Smith College. His article, Digitizing Ancestral Memory, Garifuna Settlement Day in the Americas and in Cyberspace, is included in a 2019 University of Liverpool Press publication, Indigenous Interfaces. Dr. López is currently working on a book manuscript, Hemispheric Black Indigeneity, The Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York. He teaches courses on Black, Latin American, and US Black Latinx social movements, Black diaspora theories and ethnographies, Black feminisms, queer theory. And our final speaker will be Dr. Nemata Blyden. Dr. Blyden is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. Her most recent monograph, published by Yale University Press in 2019, is African Americans and Africa, A New History. Dr. Blyden's publications include Relationships Among Blacks in the Diaspora, African and Caribbean-born Blacks, and in 2009, she published A Perspective of the African Diaspora in the United States. Dr. Blyden has also published on themes including women in 19th century Liberia and West Indian migration to Sierra Leone. So welcome all presenters, and welcome to you, members of the audience. We look forward to a textured discussion on notions of home and homeland. And we will begin with Professor Violet Showers Johnson.
Thank you, Professor Collins, for that introduction. And thank you very much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate. I am happy to be here. Today, in the short time I have for the presentation, I would like to share one of my ongoing projects in my scholarship on the history of immigrants of African descent in the United States. The project is on diasporic transnational philanthropy. It's a salient theme in Black immigration history and the history of the African diaspora. Remittances, the practice of sending money for the upkeep of close and extended family, is an important facet of the Black immigrant experience. By the late 20th century, the prevalence of remittances was being fully illustrated by the ubiquitous presence of money transfer companies like Western Union and MoneyGram at various Black immigrant events, from Caribbean carnivals to commemoration of independence of African and Caribbean nations, and a variety of African ethnic and religious cultural festivals. While individual remittances of monetary and other forms of assistance to family is a staple in Black immigrant enclaves, collective philanthropy is crucial. My project focuses on the latter. I am currently researching as case study the mission and activities of Sisters of Sierra Leone, a 501c charitable women's organization based in Dallas, Texas. The membership, initiatives, and activities of this organization offer useful insights for understanding diverse articulations and management of place, home, identities, and multiple belonging. Sisters of Sierra Leone was founded in 1998 during the decade-long Sierra Leone Civil War. The war ended in 2001. With post-conflict development as the main impetus for its founding, rebuilding the homeland was placed at the center of the organization's existence. According to the organization's mission and vision statement, and I quote, "It is the vision of the Sisters of Sierra Leone of North Texas to contribute to the redevelopment and rehabilitation of the Sierra Leone nation by giving assistance to various communities through empowering the leaders of these communities, enabling them to return to a life of productivity and purpose," end of quote. Sisters of Sierra Leone adopted a gendered approach to its nation building objective. The organization declared clearly that its emphasis would be on promoting the rights of women, excuse me, to empower them to rebuild their families and their communities. Accordingly, even before the formal end of the war, from its base in Metro Dallas, the newly formed organization began to fundraise and strategize for its woman-focused collective philanthropy from the diaspora. By the end of the war, Sisters of Sierra Leone had launched its development agenda. A short list put out by the organization outlining its activities provides an informative snapshot of this agenda. Send books and other supplies for the education of girls. Support orphanages housing children rendered parentless by the war. Send medical and general health care supplies for women and their families. Develop a mobile clinic and establish micro-lending to launch new women-owned businesses as well as expand existing ones. Quite a list. The organization faced challenges, many of which involved the transfer and distribution of cash and supplies. Given that its members do not reside permanently on site in Sierra Leone, the organization has had to rely on members who visit Sierra Leone temporarily, anywhere from as short as 2 weeks to as long as several months. During these visits, in addition to attending to their own personal family matters, the members pursue an array of activities on behalf of their Texas based organization. They render public health services, including setting up short term mobile clinics. They distribute cash to and consult with women looking to start or expand small businesses, and they visit orphanages supported by Sisters of Sierra Leone, spending time with and collecting information about children adopted by the organization. The visiting members do not work alone. They always collaborate with individuals and groups based in the homeland communities. Some of these individuals and groups have become long-term intermediaries in the transnational philanthropic exercise. While many of the challenges posed by the logistics of transporting and distributing supplies were anticipated, what the collaborations revealed about the identities of the returning Sierra Leoneans and their shifting place in their home country was an eye-opener for most of the members. Although theoretically the participants in the partnership in the post-war development enterprise are all Sierra Leoneans, there are now vital differences between them based on their idiosyncratic experiences in their current physical locations. From the first point of contact, the homeland partners viewed Sisters of Sierra Leone representatives as the other Sierra Leoneans. This otherness is publicly expressed by the labeling of visiting Sierra Leoneans who live abroad, not only those who visit from America, but visiting Sierra Leoneans generally from places like Britain, Canada, and of course the United States. They have labeled them in the Creole vernacular, the language, Joscam, which means the newly arrived. And this has been abbreviated to the more common usage of JC. Throughout the course of interaction, the distinctly different identities of JC and long and home-based Sierra Leoneans subtly and visibly influence the dynamics of the partnership. The Sierra Leone home-based partners observe changes in the outlook of the JCs, especially in some of the visitors' proposed approaches, which may work well in Texas, but not in Sierra Leone. For their part, the JCs are frustrated by a Sierra Leone whose post-war problems are vastly more severe than anything they had encountered before emigrating. As the organization succeeds in its diasporic philanthropy on behalf of the homeland, its members continue to learn important lessons about their identities and place in Sierra Leone, as well as in America. In Sierra Leone, effectively, they are American Africans. Often, mostly casual observers, but sometimes scholars and students of the immigrant experience talk about individual and collective philanthropy in immigrant communities as a one-directional phenomenon, one that involves, as it were, the siphoning of income earned in America to other countries. This viewpoint has been useful for opponents of immigration and those who resent specific types of immigrants. Sisters of Sierra Leone, as a case study, offers ample evidence that challenges this one-directional, exclusive homeland-bound argument. The organization's own description of its membership alludes to the centrality of the dual focus of its mission. It describes its members as, and I quote, professional women from Sierra Leone who have made the United States their permanent home, end quote. It is thus not surprising that also at the center of the organization's agenda is the building of the emerging Sierra Leonean immigrant community in Texas. Simultaneously, as it was initiating its agenda for the reconstruction of Sierra Leone, the organization was contributing to the construction of a viable, permanent, and visible Sierra Leonean community in metropolitan Dallas. The story of Sisters of Sierra Leone is very much a story of dedication to the development of two sites, homeland and home. Some studies of Black immigrant communities have concluded that the women are more committed to developing their American homes than the men who, harboring homeland political aspirations, are fiercely passionate about homeland politics. For example, sociologist Mary Oswin, in her study of African women in Greater Boston and Philadelphia, discovered that the African women formed strong coalitions with other minorities, especially Afro Caribbean immigrants and American born African Americans, to develop viable pan Black neighborhoods in those cities. Sociologist Gillian Priest found similar patterns in Vancouver, where the first generation immigrant African men focused more on maintaining links with the homeland, while the women delved into devising strategies for making Canada home. I did not see this clear cut dichotomy between the men and women in Metro Dallas Sierra Leonean community. On the contrary, the work of Sisters of Sierra Leone in the construction of the American home is undertaken within the broader context of a coalitionist strategy that effectively includes men, women, and a host of organizations. By 2010, the relatively small Sierra Leonean immigrant community of less than 10,000 had over 20 organizations. These organizations run the gamut from ethnic hometown organizations to American chapters of Sierra Leonean political parties, secondary school alumni associations, and charitable and cultural groups like Sisters of Sierra Leone. As an active leading member of the coalition to shape and sustain the community of Sierra Leoneans who have made America their permanent home, Sisters of Sierra Leone has had to address important questions and concerns involved in building such a community in a race-based and racist milieu. The organization and its members are keenly aware of the intersectional spaces in which they pursue their diasporic transnational philanthropy, spaces in which they must grapple with their changing identities and multiple belonging. So this is really a summary of my ongoing study of Sisters of Sierra Leone. What I hope to illustrate in the much more detailed article to emerge from this research, and which I hope the snapshot I just offered succeeded in showing, is the complexities of navigating transnational spaces and constructing an American ethnic slash immigrant community, which in its American physical location is also Black. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Johnson. Now, Professor Paul Joseph López.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope just want to get started today with good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good morning to wherever you find yourself at the moment. Thank you for having me. It's still pinching myself honor to join you all. A special shout out of gratitude to Kate, Keith, and all of the amazing folks over at the University of Maryland's College Park Center for Global Migration Studies for the incredible support with the logistics and invitation. And to my esteemed panelists, I'm very much looking forward to being in dialogue with you all. I want to take a moment to recognize my presence on the territories of indigenous nations, the Nape, Nayake, and the Canarse, and those not recognized by the state of New York, to bear witness to the centuries-long legacies of survival and resistance of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and throughout the Americas. My work could not be possible without a meditation on the impacts of settler colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, indigenous resistance, and on the legacies of what M. Jackie Alexander calls crossings, or rather, our continually overlapping histories of dispossession. For today's conversation, I offer some preliminary probing thoughts on how Garifuna New Yorkers make, imagine, perform, articulate notions of home, homeland, vis-a-vis public performances of ancestral memory in the hemispheric, diasporic spaces of the Bronx, Harlem, and Eastern Brooklyn, specifically Brownsville, Bushwick, and Canarsie. New York City is home to the largest Garifuna community outside of Central America's Caribbean coasts. Since the late 1950s, Garifuna New Yorkers are negotiating transgenerational migrations, building cultural movements, and engage transnational political mobilizations beyond multiple borders of nation states and racial and ethnic subjectivities. Garinagu, plural form of Garifuna, are descendants of shipwrecked enslaved West Africans and Carib Arawak indigenous peoples on the Lesser Antillean island of St. Vincent. In 1797, British colonial forces exiled Garinagu to the Bay Islands of Honduras, sparking a diasporic ethnogenesis through subsequent migrations to Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and mainland Honduras. At the turn of the 20th century, the United Fruit Company held an economic monopoly, or what Glenn Chambers refers to as banana plantations on Central America's Caribbean coast. The eventual collapse of this economy ignited the first major wave of migrations for Black Central Americans to the United States' major port cities, such as New Orleans, Miami, Chicago, San Francisco, and New York City. Subsequent Garifuna migration flows continue to the present day due to electoral corruption, gang violence, land dispossession, and economic repression in Central America. These more recent migrations have drastically shifted the political and racialized demographic landscape of the US South cities, such as Houston, Atlanta, Charlotte, and Tampa. In my work, I specifically use the term Garifuna New Yorkers to conceptually demark a geopolitically specific notion of Garifunaness that is diasporically bounded to the largest Garifuna geography outside of Central America's Caribbean coast, New York City. The term also serves to highlight the US imperial relationship through which Garifuna Central Americans enter the US as a result of forced migrations that begin after the economic collapse of the banana plantations in Honduras in the mid-20th century. The term Garifuna New Yorkers also allow us to transcend the obsessive dilemma imposed by sociological assimilationist theories of generations. In other words, my work and my thinking around Garifuna New York, instead of focusing on a fixed temporal migratory timeline, I turn my attention to how multiple generations of Garifuna New Yorkers are all at once in conversation with one another. Instead of centering assimilation tropes such as notions of homeland, country of birth, the nostalgia of immigration, and the challenges faced by children of immigrants and their descendants, I turn to how the rich dialogues between those multiple generations transcend sociological preoccupations with Americanization. Garifuna New Yorkers who arrived in the 1950s and Garifuna New Yorkers born and raised in the 1970s through the 90s and early 2000s negotiate, articulate, and perform disparate notions of their Black Indigenous politics. My larger book project, Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, The Queer Politics of Self-Making Garifuna New York, is a transdisciplinary ethnographic study that centers the political mobilizations, cultural expressions, and safe self-making practices of Garifuna New Yorkers. By bringing together oral histories, social media analysis, fiction and documentary film interpretations, and ethnographic data, I examine how Garifuna New Yorkers transgenerationally perform, articulate, and negotiate their multiple and overlapping Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Latinx subjectivities. I argue that Garifuna New Yorkers ground their Black indigeneity in St. Vincent, thus articulating a hemispheric self-making manifested through cultural expressions, performance, ancestral memory, and visual cultures, routed onto Central America's Caribbean coast and rooted in the United States. Garifuna New Yorkers as a geopolitical and transgenerational racial identity formation unearthed for us decades of understudied political, cultural, ancestral, and ethno-racial articulations, mobilizations, and contestations that queer our notions of Blackness, indigeneity, and Latinidad in the United States and throughout the Americas. I want to spend some time talking a little bit about today, this particular chapter that I'm working on, titled Performing Indigenous Blackness, Ancestral Memory in the Garifuna Diaspora. And I want to spend a few moments talking about standing on the theoretical and the genealogical shoulders of Black queer feminist theorists, such as M. Jackie Alexander, Audre Lorde, Jafari Allen, and Omi Shakin Natasha Tinsley. My queer reading of Garifunanis throughout my work centers on a twofold praxis of resistance, as Tinsley writes, quote, queer not in the sense of a gay or same-sex loving identity waiting to be excavated from the ocean floor, but as a praxis of resistance. Queer in the sense of marking disruption to the violence of normative order, and powerfully so, connecting in ways that commodified flesh was never supposed to, loving your own kind when your kind was supposed to cease to exist, forging interpersonal connections that counteract imperial desires for Africans living death, end of quote. Homosapien Natasha Tinsley breaks path to help us rethink how the Black Atlantic has always been the queer Atlantic, how the relationship between queerness and Blackness is always in the praxis of resistance to white supremacy, hegemony, commodifications, and borders. My queer reading of Garifuna folks here and beyond is one that centers the silences and erasures of the political and cultural labor that LGBTQ plus identified Garifuna peoples, whom are at the forefront of political movements of preserving Garifuna culture, language, and history, are to be seen. Alongside how a queer reading of Garifuna opens up the possibilities of zooming into a praxis of resisting hegemonic structures and institutions of compartmentalizations, categorizations, and dislocations. In its simplest form, for today's conversation and for the larger book project, I want to ask, what does it mean to be Garifuna in the 21st century in New York City and throughout the Americas? How does the multiplicity of Garifuna Black indigeneity contest or disrupt notions of Blackness, indigeneity, and Afro-Latinidad in the Americas? How do Garifuna folks mobilize politically, culturally, and diasporically to preserve their culture, language, and history? And more importantly, what is always already queer about being Garifuna? I spent some time here thinking about ancestral memory, particularly as an analytic to closely examine how political imaginaries mobilize performance of an embodied archive. an act of conjuring the past into the present and future. Garifuna political imaginaries of ancestrality as embodied archives produce political subjectivities conjured by Garifuna women for Garifuna folks throughout their diasporas. I contend that the sacredness of memory is a manifestation of ancestral presence on, to, and through the flesh in the political imaginaries of Garifuna Settlement Day. The visual medium of films such as El Espíritu de mi Mamá, and digital spaces such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. I'm particularly invested and interested in the ways in which Garifuna ancestral memory, as an analytic, closely observes the political imaginations of how Garifuna self-make their Garifunaness, always already in diaspora, always already in the Americas. How does ancestral memory politicize Garifuna folks in and out of Central America's Caribbean coast? And moreover, how does the conjuring, invocation, and reenacting of ancestral memory inform the political mobilization of Garifuna New Yorkers in their own diasporas? And I think it's important, before I turn to the images that accompany me in today's conversation, to situate a little bit about the analysis on the performance, right? So before turning on to the performance of Garifuna ancestral memory, I want to also situate the histories of anti-Black racism on Central America's Caribbean coast, particularly paying close attention to the ways in which those histories and present-day realities shape how Garifuna New Yorkers in diaspora and on the Isthmus politically mobilize to preserve and restore their culture, language, and history in the face of what Dr. Juliet Hooker refers to as mestizo multiculturalism, and then turn to, in the United States, that the invocation of Central America conjures a set of racial and political imaginaries that in fact are anti-Black and actually center mestizos, indigenous cultures, revolutionary movements, civil wars, and US occupations that most certainly at times eclipse a discussion of race and racism in the region. In Central America, race and racism is obscured by the ghost of mestizaje as an imagined racial mixture birthing a mythical racial sameness bounded by nationalism. Within Central American mestizaje, Blackness is relegated, alienated, and ascribed to the Caribbean coast. Sorry, give me 1 second. Ascribed to the Caribbean coast, erasing centuries of Black folks in the interior and Pacific coast. By ascribing Blackness and Black people to Central America's Caribbean coast, mestizaje constructs as imaginary in opposition to and in negation of Blackness, especially when the Caribbean coast is understood to be removed from the national political spaces of mestizo governance. For example, Managua in Nicaragua or Tegucigalpa in Honduras. Moreover, it renders and ascribes Central American Blackness as solely Caribbean, coming from somewhere else and not already always present prior to the formation of the Republic. More recently, Central American neoliberal multiculturalism constructs Blackness as a folkloric caricature for tourist and popular culture consumption. Therefore, so one thing that I argue in the piece is, therefore, Black Central Americans doubly negotiate their invisibilities on the isms and in their diasporas in the United States, right? So let me quickly turn to the images so I can spend a little time talking about particularly the negotiations and particularly, so one thing that the three images that I'm offering for a dialogue and conversation today are doing, and I'm going to wrap up very quickly, is that these images as an embodied archive of visual cultures of Garifuna New Yorkers really speak about how ancestral memory is certainly an embodied archive as well as an epistemology, right? A way of knowing how to be Garifuna. And I particularly turn to performance in this chapter to think about Garifuna Settlement Day as a marking of ancestral territory, as a marking particularly of of a Garifuna hemispheric understanding of New York City, as always in conversation to Central America's Caribbean coast, right? So one thing about Garifuna New Yorkers, particularly if we are to historicize their marking and arrival to the U.S. and through the U.S. South, right, as an imperial moment, how are Garifuna New Yorkers reshaping our understandings of home and homeland through their articulations of ancestral memory through these performances? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor López Oro. And finally, Professor Nemata Blyden.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. I want to say thanks to the Center for Global Migration Studies and the Smithsonian Museum of African American History for hosting us. My paper will deviate a little in its exploration of African immigrants by looking at continental Africans living in the United States in the period before the 1965 Hart-Celler legislation. This work in progress is attempting to interrogate ideas about immigration as it pertains to African-descended populations and query some of the ways that historians have outlined the immigration narrative and which groups have been designated as immigrants in particular eras. An undated biography of the artist-dancer Assata Dafora, probably written by the subject himself, tells us he was born in Freetown, Sierra Leone, as Austin Dafora Horton. Written in 1961, it tells us that he was, quote, the first African to put an African show on the American Theater and Concert Hall, and that he was currently in Sierra Leone for the country's newly independent celebrations. As we think about the meanings and experiences of home, return, dual residences, historical memory, familial ties, and cultural productions, Dafora emerges as an interesting case, particularly if explored within the framework of African immigration and the African immigrant experience. From a certain vantage point, Dafora was an African immigrant in America before 1965. His life, mostly spent in the United States, is illustrative of the ties African immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century were able to maintain with their homeland, as well as with the home in which they found themselves, the United States. Through his familial ties and dance productions, Dafora retained elements of his vision of Africa while translating them to American audiences. Assata Dafora has largely been discussed as an early pioneer of African dance in the United States and lauded for his contributions to African American dance. Examinations of his body of work have focused on his influence on African American artists such as Katherine Dunham, Alvin Ailey, Esther Rolle, and Pearl Primus, among many. His productions in the 1930s excuse me, there was a back feed. His productions in the 1930s incorporated African themes, employed Black Americans, as well as Africans living in the United States. In the many decades he was active, Dafora influenced American understanding of the musical and dance traditions of Africa and was frequently described as, quote, the foremost African dancer and musician, or as, quote, the only authentic African dance in America. Son of an illustrious Sierra Leonean family, Dafora had come to the United States to study in the 1920s. Abandoning his graduate career, he began his life as an artist in 1934 when he performed his first African dance drama, Kikonko, in New York. Receiving rave reviews, the play established Dafora as a preeminent translator of African dance and culture to an American public. He would continue to perform for more than 30 years, traveling across the country with his version of African dance and drama. My interest in Dafora has been less on his art than on his position as an immigrant in this country and his attempts to navigate American society as a Black man in the early 20th century. Africans resident in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century are often not described or even constructed as immigrants, perhaps because they came in small numbers, were transitory, and may have come without the intention of staying permanently. We rarely incorporate them into larger discussions of American immigration history. In an examination of more recent immigration of non-Europeans to the United States, Paul Spickard criticizes what he calls the Ellis Island paradigm of immigrant assimilations, which privileges a one-way migration narrative accompanied by a shedding of old ways. You shed your language, your culture, your habits on the road to becoming American. Nonetheless, he argues, quote, the Ellis Island story leaves out such central issues as race, power, slavery, genocide, colonialism, social stratification, discrimination, and differential access to membership in American society. It tends to ignore or play down the strikingly different ways that people of color experience their immigration into the United States or the United States migration into them, end quote. I'm interested in using Spickard's argument to explore the story of individuals like Dafora. The racial formation that resulted in Africans in the United States becoming Negro in the early 20th century or Black is also pertinent to my argument. Africans came to the United States during a period when the African American population was largely marginalized, struggling for their civil rights. During the late 19th and early 20th century, despite the many freedoms they had won, African Americans continued to fight for equality. Upon arrival, Africans also faced segregation and discrimination. Indeed, Africans in the United States in that era soon came to understand the articulation of race in America. In their dealings with Black Americans, they often came to reassess their own identities and understand the role of racism in American life. And this was certainly true of Dafora. How then do we understand Dafora as an immigrant? In this preliminary sort of investigation of him, I argue that by exploring his immigrant experiences and that of other Africans living in the United States at that time, we discovered that like other immigrants, Europeans, they had multiple adjustments to make. First, to the larger dominant society, the predominantly white society, and secondly, to African Americans. Recognizing that popular culture was an important avenue through which Americans could understand the continent, Dafora formed the Shogolo Oloba dance group to, quote, spread true African culture in America. He performed at all sorts of venues, regardless of audience, and was embraced, it seems, by Black Americans, as can be seen from his collaboration with many Black artists. Like African Americans, he faced discrimination and racism. So for example, when in 1946, his group was to perform at the National Concert and Artists Corps in Kansas City, the group placed them in what they termed with the best families in Kansas City because they couldn't stay at either of the two hotels in the city, right? So this is a story over and over that Northern African Americans, for example, told that story of going down south and not being able to stay in hotels. While in his early performances, Dafora catered to audiences desiring to see particular representations of Africa, the primitive, the bush African, his later performances became increasingly political. Scripts for plays which he may or may not have performed in later years make references to racism in South Africa, lynchings in the United States, as well as criticisms of colonialism. For example, in one of his scripts, the narrator ends the scene with these very strong words, quote, frightened because of the growing resistance of the colonial peoples, the victories of the Vietnam and China, the US-backed imperialists are anxious to secure the last happy hunting ground, Africa. But it is precisely because of these victories, the African people have new hope and strength. The young miners who are striking in Nigeria are resisting. The young Africans of the Gold Coast who are demanding self-government now are fighting back, end quote. So while he was placed in home, as Violet says, within the United States, he was looking at what was also going on in his homeland. So he likened, for example, the plight of colonized people with Blacks exploited in the United States by people he called Mr. Moneybags. Quote, the gentleman banker who's behind the cotton mill owners who get cheap labor in the South by keeping Negroes in colonial chains. He never dirties his hands, but he finances the factory owners whose policy it is to keep Negroes in menial jobs, to fire them first when hard times hit. And so evidence so far points to Darfur's increasing engagement with American racial politics, as well as with the growing decolonization movement worldwide. And so this incomplete picture of Darfur as immigrant is the beginning of my interrogation of American immigration history's omission of the small number of Africans who settled in the United States before 1965, and who came to terms with their Blackness, if you will, for want of a better description. Until recently, the study of African immigrants has largely been the purview of geographers and sociologists, and have focused on the post-1965 wave of immigrants from the continent. In fact, until more recently, most Americans probably had not given much thought to African immigrants. And we have a former occupant of the White House to thank, if you will, for many Americans discovering that there were African immigrants in this country. As the scholar George Sanchez notes, quote, on the most basic level, when Black people are observed on American streets, almost all Americans, even when they possess racist views, assume that who they are encountering are indeed United States citizens, despite the dramatic increase in Black migrants from Africa and the Caribbean. And Sanchez made that assessment a few years ago, and I would argue that that has changed in the last decade or so, and I can comment on that later. More recently, Jemima Peer, in her study of post-1965 Black immigrants, has argued that this inattention to African immigrants is due to, quote, the political and cultural contours of US racial formations that prevent recognition of ethno-cultural diversity among the Black population. She maintains that the inability to see Blacks as immigrants is due to the, quote, theoretical and epistemological framing of immigration studies, where Blackness is taken as the particular and peculiar test case for new, primarily non-Black immigrant incorporation, end quote. Some scholars have used the metaphor of invisibility to describe these Black migrants, and this is particularly true for the ones that I examined in the late 19th, early 20th century. Roy Bryce Laporte observed this in 1972, remarking that, quote, no place has really been given to Black immigrants and precious little to Blacks in that interpretation of American history, which describes successive waves of immigrants entering this country in search of new opportunities and contributing by their presence and participation to its cultural richness, its political complexity, its material technological advance. And Violet's co-author, Marilyn Halter, also made the point about this invisibility of the Black immigrants. So my interest has been in constructing African immigrants in the period before 1965 by looking at men and women from the continent who voluntarily made their way to the United States and made the United States their home in the late 19th and into the early 20th century. Between 1891 and 1900, an estimated 350 African migrants came to the US. In the 19th century, that number was largely made up of the Cape Verdeans who came to the United States at the end of the 19th century. Between 1900 and 1950, about 31,000 Africans entered in the United States. And that, of course, is in stark contrast, right, to the 3 million African immigrants that now reside in this country. And many of them came as students, sponsored by American missionaries. They hoped to return, but many never did. And they remained as part of the Black population and were often not distinguished in any way by policymakers or by scholars. They became immigrants, I argue, undergoing all the processes of an immigrant experience, adjustment to a new society, learning the social mores and cultural practices of their new homeland. But they also had to, in addition to those things, had to learn and come to understand how race and the racial hierarchy operated in the United States. Subsumed under the category of Negro at that time, they frequently lived among Black Americans. In 1939, The sociologist Ira Reid published The Negro Immigrant, His Background, Characteristics, and Social Adjustment. The work described the experiences of Black immigrants in the 1930s, exploring their assimilation process. Reid focused on the Black immigrant as foreign, strangers, characterizing their experience of alienation as déraciné or rootless. His interest was in examining how Black immigrants adjusted not only to the larger society into which they entered, but also to the native-born Black community. His immigrants were individuals who had left a place where they were the majority to settle in an environment where they were socially and numerically in the minority. Many sought to become American, at least as much as they could achieve that end in a racially stratified societies. However, Black immigrants were never invisible to the African Americans among whom they settled, who they worked with and who they married, and who were often their entry point into their society. And that's true of Asadata Dafora, who married an African American woman. They created a life for themselves in a hostile place, a place that was hostile to African descended people. And so it looks like my time is almost over. So I'll say that, these Africans often served as lobbyists for Africa as they worked with Americans, Black Americans, white Americans, to create more positive views and representations of Africa for the American public. And as we can see in the case of Dafora, those Africans who chose to make the United States their home in an era when men and women of African descent struggled for equality and the rights they had gained in the post-Civil War era, soon recognized that they needed to throw in their lot with African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful explorations of notions of home and homeland. And the audience is really anxious to begin asking you questions. So we have our first question for Professor Showers Johnson. Julie G asks in the chat, could you say more about gender roles and do they change as communities in the US become more settled?
Yes, among the Sierra Leonean community, actually Sierra Leone